Hello, my name is William Gowan, and this assignment is going to be covering creatine, its use, essentially taking on the argument of is it overhyped and unnecessary, or is it actually helpful for the purposes of resistance training? There is essentially two camps that exist within this, and one is basically just is it worth taking? Is it worth taking the time to put a scoop of it in your shake? The argument for it is that creatine essentially allows a greater amount of creatine in the body to be used for the creatine phosphate pathway essentially. So that way when you're lifting and you have your big intense lifts, the idea is that when you have a grinder where it's like, man, you're not sure if you can lock it out or not, creatine supplementation can maybe give you just enough extra ATP to really kind of break through that sticking point. That's the argument. Creatine's never marketed itself as a steroid-esque level of supplementation, but it's enough to just give you an edge. That's always been sort of the argument. There are those online who argue that it's essentially unnecessary. Your body already has creatine in it. Why do you need to supplement with more? So what we did was I pulled up several studies. There's lots of studies about the effectiveness of creatine. We looked that up, and then I attempted to find some studies essentially pointing out it not being very effective or not being necessary. I could not find any studies to show that it is dangerous or has any sort of adverse effects. You see non-academic sources talking about bloating and things of that nature, but when it comes to finding actual studies on PubMed, there's just not many. But we'll roll through some of these studies that we find, and we'll kind of see what we see. First study we find is a meta-analysis. I really prefer meta-analysis because this really allows us to look at a very wide body. A single study can be flawed in both the way it collects the data, the way it tests for the data, things like that. A single study, we've all seen like a single study that is wildly out of character with the rest of the literature. Meta-analysis sort of addresses that by getting a big amount of studies all together and then aggregating data from it. This meta-analysis basically just looked at the effect of creatine as it was used in muscle growth and resistance training, and that's essentially what all of them end up finding. So what they found was that for basic cardio modalities, like running and swimming, they weren't really able to find anything, but there was an increase in supplementation and resistance training for creatine, whereas against a controlled study where there was no creatine being taken, it ended up doing better. Additionally, about this study that was made by J. David Branch, that did conclude that the effects were small. Like these were not groundbreaking amounts, but it did absolutely have an effect. And this is really the most damning thing on creatine that we can seem to find, is simply that there is an effect, there's a measurable effect, it's just not super high, essentially. This is a bit conflicted, with other studies though that we do find, where we have where we have a study where we have lifters where they take creatine, they find that they have a better output, essentially. This one reviewed 22 studies, and overall what they found was that there was definitely margins of improvement. Now, where this really, really lived on the high ends was for the 1RMs. This makes sense because the creatine phosphate system is all about those big, heavy, intense, very short efforts. Something like a max effort, 1 rep max, and a barbell bench, squat, deadlift, that sort of thing. That's really where creatine kind of lives and breathes, is in those short, intense amounts. And so it makes sense that during these really, really intense efforts that we would see a lot of improvement. This ends up painting quite a picture, doesn't it? So whenever we have sort of longer term training modalities like running, endurance training, things like that, the creatine phosphate system just doesn't seem to be affected much by having that extra creatine supplemented in it, because it's not really relying upon that energy pathway very much. However, when we look at heavy 1RMs being demonstrated, for some of these folks, the effects were as high as 45%. That's wild. What that essentially tells us is creatine effective for us or not is largely going to be dependent upon the style of training that you're going to be doing. Somebody who's training for Hyrox will maybe not get a lot of benefit from creatine supplementation, but strongman competitors, powerlifters, throwers, sprinters, maybe even, might have a lot more benefit comparatively when they look at it. Another population that would likely benefit from this, according to this meta-analysis that was done by Michaela C. Dreves, I'm not sure how you say that, is the older population. When we looked at it, we saw that older athletes and lifters and fitness enthusiasts, clients, whatever an age we want to give them, did benefit from increased muscle mass, strength gain, and performance over resistance training alone. Now, but again, the kind of problem we sort of run into is just by what effect, right? Like, we obviously have metrics here. However, the ultimate conclusion they come to is that there needs to be more further work. But what we're, again, starting to really get a clear picture of what this can do. When it comes to the acquisition of strength and muscle mass, having extra creatine absolutely seems to help. And this is also true of our older clients, because they're being affected by sarcopenia. You know what I mean? They're actively combating the loss of muscle, and there's nothing better to address that than resistance training, especially resistance training with a good high protein diet in addition to that, to kind of combat and in some ways, I guess, reverse sarcopenia. So it's true of older clients and people doing heavy strength training that creatine is a useful supplement. I really was trying hard to find academic sources that sort of refuted the effects of creatine, because everything that I found mostly made it look like it was a very positive thing. This is the closest one I could find. Now, this was not a meta-analysis. This was a randomized control trial. And they basically had two groups. They had one doing resistance training, and then just normal diet and stuff, and the other resistance training with creatine. What they found was that the resistance training in older men significantly increased their muscle mass, but the creatine and protein supplementation did not help them. I find that very strange. The reason why I'm a little suspicious of this one, I'm not saying anything bad about MG Bemin or anything like that. I'd be, very, very ready to believe that a group of resistance training males didn't gain additional benefits from creatine supplementation, because you know how it is. If sometimes you'll see athletes going for hypertrophy, they'll be doing heavy 5s, heavy 8s, really moving some iron, and they can see fantastic results. But you've also seen other clients as well do things with like 20s and like doing tempo reps and myo reps and things like that, and they can also get some great results from that. So it wouldn't be strange to me to see a group that did very well, sort of regardless of getting protein supplementation or not, because hypertrophy can be done in a couple different rep ranges. I am a little surprised that this randomized controlled trial found that supplementing with protein didn't help. That's a little strange. So, it's a 14-week program with, double blind. Like, it looks like all of the actual study protocols were good, but the conclusion to that was that there was no benefit for protein supplementation. And that's where I kind of have to take a step back and say, that's strange. So that's where, again, we have to look and say, how much does an individual study or an individual trial, how much does it affect the literature as a whole? When we look at the meta-analyses, we see either that it has an effect or it has a small effect. And then we get these individual one-off studies saying that it doesn't have an effect. It's a much larger body of information to be combating, if that makes sense. Looking at this, I think what can we interpret from this data? I think it is safe to interpret that creatine has a positive effect on several populations. One, lifters that work with high intensity, low rep, modalities, reps and set schemes, things like that. 5x5, 3x5, powerlifting training, strongmen, people who do very plyometric explosive type training for like throwing, things like that. Those athletes who really need that big, intense burst really seem to benefit from protein supplementation. For folks who have longer, grindier, more endurance based training programs, creatine phosphate just may not necessarily be very beneficial. And another one is individuals seeking hypertrophy, but doing it in much higher rep ranges who don't get into those really big, intense, like all out efforts. A lot, and obviously, older males and females, for that matter, even though it's not mentioned, should be strength training and doing resistance training for the purposes of gaining muscle mass and combating sarcopenia. I think both sides of the argument would likely see that. But overall, I think the data is fairly clear about it. It's not cut and dry, but I'm sorry, there's just some dude bros on Reddit who are just not getting enough studies to support their claims. Anyway, hope you all have a great night.